Afternoon. Today we're going to discuss several aspects of testing in nursing. We're going to look at the purpose of testing, policies surrounding testing administration and academic integrity, test analysis, and what do we do with all of those numbers. And finally, after we analyze the test and post the student scores, we're going to determine what's the best process for performing post-test reviews with the students. In this diagram, we can use the information here to discover the purpose of testing. So instruction and education really hinges on three interconnected elements. We have the planning phases, the teaching phases, and the assessment phase. And the planning stage requires us defining our instructional goals and the desired student learning outcomes. And then we must plan so that we can have deliberate learning activities and methods that support the students in reaching these student learning outcomes. And finally, the learning outcomes and activities inform our assessment methods. So through analyzing the student's performance and through item analysis, the assessments that we give can help refine and adjust these teaching strategies. So we see this figure kind of illustrates that dynamic and cyclical relationship between planning, instruction, and assessment in the educational process. So this diagram specifically shows planning. It's the starting point where the instructional objectives are defined. Planning then flows downward through the development of the learning outcomes and then the instructional activities. And these steps help ensure that our teaching is intentional and is very goal-directed. Then we move into these instructional objectives and our learning outcomes and the activities that we do. And each step kind of builds on the previous one. So these instructional objectives are going to tell us, what the educator aims to teach. These learning outcomes are going to define what students should be able to do or what they know after the instruction. And then the instructional activities is how are we going to get this message across to the student? How are we going to help them achieve these outcomes? And then finally, in big bold letters at the bottom, you see assessment. So assessment really interacts with every part of the process. It informs the planning by highlighting, what do we need to teach or what do we need to adjust that we're teaching. It evaluates whether the learning outcomes are being achieved, and it influences the choices and effectiveness of the instructional activities. So you can see that the arrows kind of point from assessment, point up to each individual component, and it shows that it's not just an endpoint, that the assessment can provide the feedback to modify the planning and the instruction of an ongoing course development. A testing administration and integrity plan or policy is crucial to outline and adhere to academic integrity and honesty, ensure fairness, and maintain the validity and reliability of assessments. So you want to make sure that the students' test results are an accurate measurement of student achievement. And the only way we can do this is to protect the integrity of the test and create an environment where students can comfortably take the test without interruption. We know our students get distracted easily, so we want to create a policy that's going to give the students the best opportunity for success. So some components of a testing administration and integrity policy include pre-testing preparation, such as like your room setup, materials that you need for tests. Sometimes if it's a high-stake test, you need ID verification, certain seating arrangements, time limits, how you're going to provide accommodations to students who have permissions for such, what items are going to be permitted in the testing area. And now that many courses are taught online, the use of online proctoring services and protocols, we need to make sure that the students understand and are aware of academic integrity policies of the universities so that they know what they're being held accountable to. So with that, we need to make sure that we highlight security measures and then consequences that define that academic dishonesty with infractions to test security procedures, and then how are they going to be held accountable. So each school of nursing should sit down with their faculty and develop a plan that's appropriate for their schools. Schools can use the NCSBN NCLEX candidate rules as a framework for developing their own, implementing any additional information that may be specific to their institution's academic integrity policy. And so at my particular institution, we sat down and we did use the NCSBN candidate rules as our framework because essentially we want our students to test in an environment that will be very familiar when they sit to take NCLEX. At NCLEX, they're not allowed to have food or drink or items at their desk. They're not allowed to have a smartwatch. They're not allowed to have their book bags, their coats, their hats. they're not allowed to have access to electronic devices. They can't have, study notes or cell phones or smartphones, smartwatches, fitness bands. All of that kind of bred into our testing policy. And then we took into account just some of our personal experience with what had worked and what had not worked in the past. Our academic integrity guidelines are very clear cut and outlined in every single syllabus, and that's given to us from our institution. It comes with very specific consequences and how each infraction will be judged and evaluated. So what we do in my class particularly is when they come in, they know the policy. We kind of do a mock test at the beginning of the semester so they know what will be the test day policies, what can they expect, what are my policies. Book bags have to be at the front of the room if you bring anything in at all. Smartwatches and cell phones have to be left in a basket at the front of the room. If you're wearing a hat, it has to be turned backwards. No big coats or blankets. When we were doing paper tests, we were very particular about students highlighting information on the test because we learned in a previous incident that was how students were cheating on tests. So some of your testing policy will change and evolve as you learn how crafty or creative your students can be with testing the academic honesty boundaries. But really, it is a policy that should be put in place as a group so that students know from each semester exactly what's accepted, where one instructor doesn't have a different plan or policy than the others. And ideally, all of it should be modeled after the NCSBN's candidate rules for when they sit and take NCLEX. And again, as we stated previously, on test day, we need to make sure that our testing administration and integrity policy is upheld. If we are going to assign certain seating arrangements, where do their personal belongings go? How much time do they have for the test? We want to make sure that they understand the expectations during and after the test. For example, I ask my students as soon as they're finished taking their test, would they please exit the building and not hang out right outside of the classroom? I do ask them that they don't discuss specific test questions when they leave the classroom. Now, we know that students are going to discuss questions to some extent, but if we find out that students have actually copied material or using their recollection of what was on a test to provide to another student or to another cohort, then that is in a violation of our academic integrity policy. Also, we have some students that will have disability accommodations. All of those accommodations are held and are accommodated in our disabilities testing center. So any student with accommodations, they have to process all of their paperwork through the disability center. The disability center will then send the instructors notification that the student should receive, what type of accommodations, and then they will actually test in the disability center. Let's look at the purpose of a test analysis. What's the big picture? And then we're going to move on to the individual item analysis. So most testing software is going to provide you statistical data to analyze the test as a whole and then the individual items on the test. So what does all this tell us? Well, one, the goals of doing this is going to help us identify if we have any flawed questions. It's going to help us correct errors and adjust the raw score as necessary. And then it's a way that we can continually improve items for future use. So next we're going to be looking at how do we analyze the test as a whole. There are 3 different ways that we can kind of analyze the test as a whole. We're going to look at measures of central tendency, we're going to look at measures of validity, and measures of reliability. Measures of central tendency help us summarize the overall performance of the students, and this includes the mean, the median, and the mode. So now the mean is the average score on the test. This number can always be skewed by outliers, so we have to be really careful. If one student did particularly well or if one did much worse than the majority of the group, then this number can be impacted. So when we have outliers that are present, the median is really a great measure of central tendency. The median tells us the middle scores when all the scores are arranged in order. And the mode is the score that appears the most frequently. This measure of central tendency may not be reported with all testing software statistical analyses. Analyzing measures of validity. Measures of validity ask the question, did the test measure what it was intended to measure? So validity is not necessarily based on a statistical formula or a fixed range of values or rules, and it can't really be quantified. So validity on exam ensures that it's fair, but determining the validity of a test really hinges on certain judgment calls. So when we look at content validity, this asks, does the test cover the content it's supposed to? Do the questions reflect your learning objectives or your course outcomes? So to ensure content validity, the exam should follow the blueprint. And additionally, peer judgment can offer insight and help evaluate content validity. Now, criterion-related validity asks, how well does the test correlate with external measures of performance? Now, for nursing exams, that performance measure is often the NCLEX pass rate. And then last, we have construct validity. Construct validity means that you can evaluate what degree does this test truly measure the theoretical concept or the quality indicators it's intended to. So for nursing exams, this may be critical thinking or clinical judgment. So to evaluate construct validity, you should examine the questions, if they're higher level of thinking according to Bloom's, and are there a variety of question types on this exam. So some strategies to strengthen the validity of a nursing test includes developing and following a test blueprint, making sure that every test question is actually aligned with a learning outcome, and seeking help of your peers when developing a test helps to ensure the validity of an exam as well. Reliability means that results of this exam are consistent and reproducible. If you give the same test a second time to the same individual, the score should be the same. So we can measure reliability with a couple of different methods. First, we have the test and the retest method. This method determines the reliability of a test by giving the exact same test after a period of time and comparing the correlation between the two scores. This method is not typically very practical in nursing education just because timing and the feasibility of it. The parallel form method is where reliability can be determined from given the same group of students two equivalent versions of a test and comparing the correlation of the scores. The two versions of the test should cover the same content, be of equal difficulty, and be statistically similar. This method is useful so that alternate tests can be validated and you have two versions of the test available in case you needed it for security reasons, for makeup tests, for remedial makeup retests, if you have different cohorts or sections of a course that you want to give them a similar test but not the exact same test. So there's a lot of value in doing parallel form reliability measures. And then the ones that we use probably most common is the internal consistency method. And so the first two methods aren't always easy or practical. So most of the time, the nurse educator is going to evaluate the statistical reliability of a single test administration through the reliability coefficient. And this is a number 0 to 1, where 0 is no reliability and 1's perfect reliability. So it's important to note that you will never see perfect reliability, okay? But there's a couple of different internal consistency measurements. One is the split half reliability coefficient. A split test is when a test is split into two equal halves and the reliability of each half is compared. If the test is reliable, then both halves should have similar results. The next one that we're going to look at is the Kuder-Richardson's Formula 20, which we call the KR20, and the coefficient alpha. And these are the averages of all possible splits of a test and the indications of the degree to which the individual test items on a test correlate with the overall test score and how well a test correlates with itself. So choosing one or the other really depends on the type test being given. For tests where there is clearly a right or wrong answer, like the multiple choice test that we often give, KR20 is fairly appropriate. The coefficient alpha is best for tests that include non-dichotomous items. So it really works well when you have a mix of items, especially those new NGN style, next gen style items or rating scales. So either one would be appropriate. The KR20 reliability coefficient measurement is great for the multiple choice exams, which we use very frequently in nursing. So one of the things to note is that this can be influenced by the number of questions on the exam, the number of exam takers, and multiple correct answers. And so as you can see with this chart here, if our KR is 0 to 0.5, it's usually a poor outcome, a poor reliability indicator. It's fairly acceptable, especially for teacher-developed tests, to be 0.5 to 0.85. Your standardized tests are probably going to be greater than 0.85, and we say that it's a fairly good reliability if it's 0.7 to 1. Quality of question items should be evaluated after you've looked at the test as a whole. Okay, so we need to evaluate the item difficulty, the item discrimination, and evaluate the distractors. So item difficulty measures the percentage of the group who choose the correct answer, and we usually identify this as a p-value. And so you can kind of see in the chart here, if 81 to 100% of the class gets an item correct, we say that that item was relatively easy. 30 to 80, we would say it's kind of an average difficulty item. And anything that's less than 30% is hard. So a test item where there's a lot of items that have 90% of the class that get it correct, it really threatens the reliability of a test. So if an item has a p-value of less than 50%, we're going to want to evaluate that item. There could be a problem with the answer key, or the question itself could use revision. If the item has a p-value of like 81 to 100, then you probably want to evaluate the quality of the distractors, evaluate, are you teaching to a test, or are you testing knowledge rather than that application or higher. Now, just because you have items that have 100% correct, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad item, because there are some times where there are concepts that we teach so hard in class that we expect that 100% of the students should get that question right, especially if we're trying to assess basic knowledge. Item discrimination measures how well a question discriminates between the higher performing students and the lower performing students. So we can do item discrimination using the point by serial index, and that gives us a range of numbers from -1 to +1. So we always want to see a positive point by serial index, never a negative. So if it's less than 0.1 or into the negatives, it's poor discrimination and we need to do something about it. 0.1 to 0.29 is fair, but we really want to see it above 0.3. Okay, so a point by serial index that is high says that the high achieving students answer the items correctly more frequently than the lower achieving students. So good questions are answered correctly more often by the top performers than those students who tend to struggle. So if your lower students are doing better on an item than your top performers, then that's a big red flag. Sometimes this is reflected in a knowledge-based question, because the high-achieving students tend to overthink the question and the lower students answer it for what it actually is. So again, if the point by serial index is greater than 0.3, especially greater than 0.4, that's awesome. 0.3 to 3.9 is good, but we may need to examine the STEM and some options for clarity. 0.2 to 0.29 is kind of marginal, and you should look for problems with the STEM and the distractors. 0.1 to 0.9 is a weak discrimination, and you probably should revise the STEM and the distractors. And 0 to 0.1 is very weak, so you'll want to consider maybe rejecting or accepting multiple answers. And anything that's negative is just unacceptable, and you should readjust or accept multiple answers for that item. So distractor evaluation analyzes how well the incorrect option challenges the students. So if the distractor is chosen by some students, then it's a good distractor. If the distractor is never selected, then it's not a good distractor. And if the distractor is chosen more than the correct answer, then we kind of need to look at it, because it may be confusing and we need to revise that item. So a good item discrimination for the distractor is when all distractors are selected by the students. So a good distractor has got to be plausible enough that some students choose them, especially the lower performing students. And now finally, once we've evaluated the test as a whole, we've looked at individual items, we've determined how we may or may not adjust or revise the test, we've determined how the information we glean from our analysis may impact the student's overall score that we're going to assign them for that test. We need to look at how we're going to approach test review. So the purpose of a post-test review is to reinforce the learning. We want to have the opportunity to clarify any gaps in their knowledge and their processing of certain concepts, and we want to promote that clinical reason. Is there a reason why they're not getting it? And we want to address that and evaluate it with the students so that they don't continue to make those same problems in the future. So you need to consider, how will you conduct a post-test review for students? There's many different methods. Some instructors will do it with the entire class in the room. They will go over each question. The concern with that is for test security reasons. When you open up the test and show every single question, every single correct answer, even as much as you think you have a controlled environment, there's really a high risk for that to be leaked out. Some do small group revisions, some do one-on-one appointments. Most recently, our testing platform that we use will allow students to do an immediate post-test review. It doesn't show their grade because it still leaves it open for us to do our item analysis, but it lets them immediately see the incorrect answers that they got on the test. Student feedback, they've said that they really enjoy that because it kind of gives them that immediate feedback and reinforcement where they can say, why did I miss that question? Oh, what was that thought process in that moment? And sometimes if you wait, days or weeks after the test, the students have kind of forgotten how they arrived at that one particular answer. So having that immediate feedback gives them the opportunity. Again, there's always that risk factor there that they've actually seen the questions and seen the correct answers so quickly after they've seen the entire test. So obviously, they could leave the room, write down as much as they could. There's no way to completely eliminate that risk factor. But I think the really important thing is whatever method you choose, you need to start with ground rules for the review session. Who can be there? What materials can you bring? Ground rules that I'm not changing the answer. This is more about your learning than your arguing abilities. And some students will come with great rationales. So for my students, I tell them, if you would like to challenge a test question, I need chapter, I need page, I need, any reference from the actual lecture that led you to believe your answer was correct. And not that I'll change the answer necessarily, but sometimes that gives me a good idea for how I may want to revise that question, or, did I misspeak in class and offer information that was confusing to the student? So it helps me actually evaluate as well. But just always consider test security. One of the great things that we're seeing a lot in the literature right now is metacognition strategies, especially with like exam wrappers. And really with this, we want the students to learn how to self-reflect on why they chose certain answers. What did they do to study or prepare? Was it adequate? What do I need to do differently next time? It's just really a moment of self-reflection for them when you use the metacognition strategies. And so specifically these exam wrappers, they help students go through that metacognition process. They can think through what impacted their performance on the overall test, how they arrived at the answers on each individual incorrect answer. And so there's 3 parts to an exam wrapper. Students answer questions about the test before they see their scores, and these questions focus on how they prepare and ask students to predict their grade. The next step is to review the missed items and evaluate reasons for why they missed the question. And the third part is where students create an action plan for improvement. Now, I've read several different articles about exam wrappers and talked to several different instructors. I've even heard about it at conferences before. And it seems like everyone has a different method for an exam wrapper. But basically, it just follows the guidelines of getting a student to self-reflect and evaluate their process for learning and preparing for a test, evaluate their process during the test, and then to really reflect on how can I do better next time? Is there a concept that I need to go remediate on? Do I need to revise my study habits and my study skills? Do I need to focus on something differently? Should I try a different method in class for note taking or receiving the information? So the metacognition strategies really help students evaluate their test taking process. For listening to this presentation today. As always, here are the references for the insight and information that came from this. And if you have any questions or concerns, I'd be more than happy to speak with you, and you can reach me at my Liberty email address, abritton2@liberty.edu.